Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in this special day, we will be opening our discussion onto something more than the scientific basis that was the fundamental coverage of the previous 2 days, going a little more towards the political problems that we are confronting today. It is clear, I think, that the 3 or 4 issues have become clear from the discussions of the last 2 days. First among these is that while some of the poorest countries, especially in Africa, have contributed least to the problems of climate change through the greenhouse gas emissions, they are inordinately suffering the consequences of the negative consequences of climate change. Secondly, that climate change is already here. It is not just something that will come 20, 30, 40 years from now. No, it's already here. Just look at the enormous heat waves that are striking parts of the West, and look also at the problems in Pakistan, where 33 million people have been displaced by floods and more than 1,300 have died as of now. Therefore, the developing countries need to receive support to launch adaptive and resilience measures. But to speak to us about the whole problem, we have the most outstanding speaker we could think of. My good friend Jeff Sachs, who's now here. I would say, of course, he is technically an American economist, academic, a public policy analyst, key advisor to the UN, expert on sustainable development, economic development, the fight against poverty. He's published many books on these subjects, which I commend to you because they are excellent. But I want to say a few things more personally about him. Jeff was at Harvard. He was always brilliant. He got his BA, MA, PhD, but at the age of 28, he became a full professor with tenure at Harvard. He also was the director of the Harvard Institute for International Development at the Kennedy School and the director of the Center for International Development at Harvard. Now at Columbia, he holds the title of university professor, which is the highest title any professor could have. And he's a former head of the Earth Institute in Columbia and currently director of the Center for Sustainable Development. But at the UN, he is the key advisor to successive Secretary Generals of the UN on sustainability questions. He is an SDG advocate for the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And I could say a lot more about Jeff Sachs, but I think we would benefit from listening to him personally. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Ismail, thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words, and so wonderful to see you and to be with you, and grateful to be with so many friends. I think we've never gathered at a time of so many simultaneous crises. The world is really overwhelmed. We're not doing well at all. We have war, financial distress, pandemic, and what we have seen this year, as Ismail was just describing, is not the harrowing future threats of climate change, but a whole world really ablaze now. Anywhere you look in the world, on top of all the other shocks that we are facing, the climate crisis is immediate. It's extraordinarily harmful, disruptive, and beyond the control of any government. In Europe, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European Union is in extreme drought. Rivers are not running. China is in the midst of a massive drought that has disrupted hydroelectric power. We have forest fires everywhere. The dryland regions are facing extreme duress. And this is in a world that hardly speaks to each other anymore. We're in so many geopolitical crises and so much domestic political instability in major regions that we're not coping. And this is the backdrop that we have to strategize. It's clear that we have created several useful, extremely important frameworks multilaterally, from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, the IPCC process, and many others that are remarkable and vital for us. But it's also clear that we are not able to implement almost any of the objectives that we have agreed to, whether it is on climate mitigation or adaptation and resilience, or ensuring access to drugs and vaccines for the pandemic, or many other challenges. The SDGs have been in serious reverse now for the past 3 years. We're not only not making sufficient progress, we are in regress. Actually, public education is in crisis all over the world. Children are not in school. The evidence is that the pandemic has cost a devastating loss of reading and numeracy skills, even in high-income countries. So I could go on with the litany of ills. The question is what to do. And I'm very gratified that Egypt will be hosting COP27 and Indonesia will be hosting the G20, because at least we have the perspective of developing countries in the forefront. And I think this is extremely important, an extremely important time for developing countries to say to the great powers, enough. We need a different approach. We are not interested in your geopolitical games, in your hegemonic struggles. We are interested in survival on this planet and in a global architecture that addresses the whole world's challenges without all of these wars. So I hope that the central message of the developing world is that we've reached a limit where alliance politics, wars, debates over NATO, East Asia, and so forth are intolerable, given the real crises that are being felt on the planet. If you look analytically at what needs to be done, and Ismail was sketching out key points of this, the agenda that the world really needs is actually discernible from the processes that we have established. We need investments in all parts of the world, but especially in the low and middle income countries, to address glaring threats and deficiencies in the way that the world economy functions. I count 6 major areas of investment: education, healthcare, energy systems, sustainable land use and climate adaptation, urban infrastructure, and digital connectivity. These areas are understood, they are well known, they require substantial financing, but they are within the economic means of the planet, well within the economic means. The sustainable development investments that we need are on the order of 2 or 3% of world output, maybe 10% of global saving. But we don't have a system to allocate global saving in an effective, resilient, and equitable manner. And in the meantime, global politics is not directing us in this way, because global politics is overwhelmingly directed at great power confrontation right now, at proxy wars and at rising geopolitical tensions in East Asia, rather than at these global solutions. As many of you know, I put a huge responsibility of failure on the United States, because the US for the past 20 years has simply not participated constructively in the global arena. It's been much more directed at maintaining global hegemony than it has been at financing and addressing global solutions. And repeatedly, the United States has walked out of multilateral fora. It's engaged in more wars than any other country on the whole planet, and it has instigated global tensions more than any other country on the planet. So I have to say, frankly, I put my own country at principal responsibility for the glaring shortfall of what needs to be done. When you identify solutions, however, they're not so hard. We created a multilateral financing system that we don't use properly. We have multilateral development banks in all regions of the world that are gravely underfinanced and underperforming. Whether it's the World Bank at the global level, or the regional development banks, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, or the new development banks like the BRICS Bank, called the New Development Bank in Shanghai, or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are crucial institutions for addressing the climate and energy challenges, but the scale of financing that goes through these international institutions is perhaps a tenth of what it ought to be. The total financing of the multilateral development bank system is around $100 billion a year, and we should be aiming for around $1 trillion a year. That's not an extraordinary number. Global saving is on the order of $25 trillion a year. Global output is on the order of $100 trillion a year. So when we have 100 billion going through the multilateral development banks, we're talking about 1,000th of world output. We're, in other words, not using the institutions and the processes that we have created actually to address the scale of the challenges that we face. My main recommendation inside the UN system, therefore, with urgency, is a massive scale up of multilateral development bank financing that would tap the global saving, that is the capital markets, at the still very low real interest rates, and on lend at long-term 30 or 40 or 50-year maturities, and at interest rates of 2 or 3 or 4% to developing countries, so that the developing countries don't have to try to go to the capital markets themselves and end up paying 10% interest on 5 or 7-year loans, and then facing repeated crises of debt finance, which are not crises of solvency, but crises of liquidity and short-term accidents, lack of liquidity in sovereign bond markets, currency mismatches, and other financial events that make it absolutely impossible for developing countries to finance this agenda on the basis of private capital alone. So the recommendation that I'm making to the Secretary General and to the UN system is a massive expansion of our multilateral development banking. One of the ironies, of course, is that this is blocked right now because of geopolitics. We can hardly move in financing the World Bank more because it inevitably then involves the relative power of China and the United States. And the US Congress, which is a perennially right-wing nationalist institution, refuses to see a scale-up of multilateral development banking that could include more responsibility and more financing for China. Around the world, the multilateral development banks are caught in a similar trap of this geopolitics right now. We need a system in which China is playing a larger role, India is playing a larger role, developing countries are playing a larger role, the US and Europe are playing proportionately a less large role, but that requires accepting the political transformation that has to go along with a transformation to a sustainable and fair world. And so while the technical solutions, more development finance in a way that is affordable and safe for developing countries, meaning long-term loans at low interest, is absolutely achievable. The practical achievement of this goal is, again, in my experience, blocked by geopolitics more than by finance or limits of funding or excessive financial burdens that would accompany the scale of financing that we need. All of you are, of course, thoroughly familiar with the failure of the rich world, even in a dozen years, to fulfill the commitment to a meager $100 billion a year for climate finance. A rather shocking demonstration of what I'm saying. The amounts involved, given that this is lending, not even grants, are tiny, and yet the developed world is absolutely incapable or uninterested in coming up with these sums. So I'm afraid that I don't have the magic wand to unblock a blocked system, but I do think that we have the technical and the institutional way forward. And that is, again, a vastly increased scale of financing made available to developing countries on the kinds of terms that rich countries routinely borrow, but poor countries or developing countries do not. And that is long-term finance at low interest in order to be able to invest in the climate adaptation and mitigation and sustainable land use and sustainable water management that are at the center of the challenge. One final point on what would be equitable and just financing is a basic point, also well known, also utterly blocked for the last 30 years. And that is that now that we're in the midst of not only the need for preparatory investments and energy system transformation, but year-to-year catastrophic costs from actual existing climate damages, real time. It has been understood for more than 30 years that the rich countries not only have responsibility to help organize a sustainable and equitable global financial architecture, but have the historical responsibilities for compensating the rest of the world for the damages that are now being incurred. If this were a normal commercial transaction, we would say the rich countries have committed a public nuisance that is a tortious violation of the rights of the rest of the world. In other words, it's subjected the rest of the world now to annual, ongoing, heavy burdens of losses and damages. And for that, we need something more than simply loans. We need compensation. But of course, the rich countries have rejected the concept of any kind of historical responsibility. I would add for anything, but including for the climate damages. And so we face yet another blockage of geopolitics. The rich countries are overwhelmingly responsible for the real-time damages being incurred, but they have been unwilling to face up to any measure of responsibility. And to this day, we do not have any kind of losses and damages fund or any kind of climate insurance funding that is properly compensated by the rich countries. Well, this is something that I would add to the agenda, but again, with very difficult prospect of actual solution. I proposed a very basic way to address this, which is that we would have a small levy based on the cumulative historical contributions of CO2 in the past. It's easy to show that one could raise tens or hundreds of billions of dollars with a very, very tiny CO2 levy based on the historical contributions, say, of emissions during the past 50 years, all extremely well documented. That could go to pay the insurance premia, in effect, for climate losses and damages and enable countries not only to invest looking forward in mitigation and adaptation, that is, an energy system transformation and adaptation, but also to address what are now annual enormous costs coming from the real-time damages that are being incurred. One final point that I'd like to make, Ismail, which is that the investment solutions that are needed, which are identifiable through good technical analysis, and which involve, as I've emphasized, energy system transformation and land use investments and changes in agricultural practices and in water management. All of those investments are rather identifiable, but they face two additional challenges to the financial challenges that I've been emphasizing. One is that the investments that need to be made have a time horizon of 20 to 25 years. For Egypt or any other country to transform the energy system in the way that we need, that is to decarbonize by mid-century, this is not a year-to-year change. This is a quarter-century change. So we need public investment planning and public investment frameworks that are long-term. And this is a challenge for governments, which almost invariably are short-term. The second challenge, even beyond the technical and the planning and the investment challenges, is that efficient solutions almost inevitably involve regional scale solutions with countries that are integrated in renewable energy grids and that are sharing responsibility for riversheds, water resources, and other ecosystem resources that cross national boundaries. So more than ever, solutions also require regional cooperation. And we come back to where I started. The greatest shortfall in our world is not technology, It's not finance. It's not plans. It's not insight into what to do. It is cooperation. This is the biggest problem that we face in humanity today, which is that our multilateral cooperation is at a low ebb. One very powerful country, my own, the United States, views the world in alliance terms. It thinks that military alliances are the path to safety, a complete illusion, and that illusion has led us into more wars than any other country. But we need cooperation within each region, and we need cooperation across regions. We have to set aside the alliance politics, the divisions, and understand that we've reached the end of the road of talk. We're already in the midst of the environmental crisis that we first heard about 50 years ago in Stockholm, that we first addressed 30 years ago in Rio, that we have made plan after plan. Now we are in the middle of a roiling crisis, and heady things like wars and sanctions and military alliances are going to be useless in the context that we now face. So let me stop there. I hope that this was even minimally useful. This is such an esteemed and knowledgeable group. I hope that I've added a little bit, but let me just close by saying that in real time right now, I'm working with the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General on these finance issues. And so I would be absolutely keen to cooperate and to exchange views in more detail with all of you. We're pressing hard to get some response from the rich countries in particular and the development banks by the time of COP27 and the G20. So that's ongoing work hour by hour these days, and very happy to continue the discussions with you on that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for these insightful analyses. And I'm sure that people here will remember how much you played the role in getting the unique period, the unique moment when all of humanity actually agreed on the Millennium Development Goals and then on the Sustainable Development Goals. Professor Sachs was the key advisor behind both of these events, which managed to get a unanimous approval of all the world. So we want the magician to come and help us one more time on some of the problems we are facing. I will look to some colleagues here if they have a question. I see Dr. Adel Beltagi is there. I have some questions for you as well. Jeff, if you can spend a few more minutes with us. Yes, please. Dr. Adel, يجيب لك ميكروفون ولا ايه؟
Hi, Jeff. It's great to see you with us today. With all what you said, as you said, the solution is blocked in three major points which you have mentioned. But do we have hope that by increasing the public opinion in the most industrial countries and in the States, in Europe, in different places, is public opinion can make the politician change their position, or even we don't have hope in this dimension? Because this is the only dimension. Politicians, they just rise on the will and the desires of the public. Therefore, if we focus on the public, it may have a solution. I would like to hear your opinion on this. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. You know, my view is that the public is not the obstacle, neither in the United States nor elsewhere. The public, in my view, is actually more manipulated by the political class than vice versa. In the United States, most people don't want war. Most people want climate action. Most people want solutions. I think, as you know, I'll just speak about the US for a moment. The political system is very corrupt because it's based on now about $15 billion of campaign contributions per election cycle. The billionaires finance the election campaigns. The US became almost a free-for-all in terms of campaign financing. So the American people don't get the kind of government that they would like, and about 85% of the American public opinion says the country is off track. I think we're in an elite game, not a public opinion game, by and large. And to my mind, the biggest change in the world that we need to mobilize is the voice of the leadership in the developing world. And I think that this is already evident with the Ukraine war. With the Ukraine war, the United States and Europe quickly announced sanctions regimes and so forth, but the rest of the world did not go along with it. I agree with the rest of the world. I don't think the rest of the world has a direct stake in this proxy war, which I view as a war between NATO and Russia. The rest of the world said, no, we don't want to be party to this. But here is where America can be swayed. America is, in its leadership, in a geopolitical battle, it thinks. It's a very naive view, but it's listening. If countries like Indonesia and like Egypt and others say to American leaders, you know, you're not on a right track. You call yourself global leader, but frankly, what global leadership now would mean would be addressing the Paris Agreement, addressing the climate crisis, ending the wars, toning down the geopolitical tensions, not creating a Cold War with China and the rest. The United States government would have to listen, actually. It really would have to listen. It's not normal for many countries to speak to US leaders like this because it's not the easiest position. But to my mind, we have entered the post-unipolar world very clearly this year. And the interests of developing countries are starkly different from what the US and Europe imagine them to be. I'm in Europe right now and listening. It's also a very war-like environment. A lot of mistaken ideas, in my view. But I think Europe and the United States need to hear very clearly, and that is the G7 also. You don't run the world, and the world's not running right. It's not running properly. And this is a message from leaders to leaders. We need something different.
Okay.
We're going into a downward spiral. So that would be my main message, not public opinion. It counts, but the public is on side, by and large, all over the world. It wants solutions.
Yeah, the public is already there. Jeff, would you want to take two or three questions and
Of
then
course.
answer them? Okay, then I'll go first to His Excellency Peter Roman, the former Prime Minister of Romania. You had your hand up, sir. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, Jeffrey.
How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was your statement was so clear and your argument so strong. It's I would say impeccable, and we are really grateful to have this opportunity to hear to you with such a convincing and in fact very simple explanation of what's going on in our world today. I was delighted when you insisted on cooperation. It's my very deep conviction since years ago when I said cooperation is not just the best solution, it's the only solution. Somehow we should start to move everybody into this phrase. Cooperation is the only solution. Beyond that there is nothing. By now we know that beyond that is nothing, because we are in fact confronted with political disruptions, increasingly strong political disruptions, which is the Russian war in Ukraine and the new Cold War between China and the US. These political disruptions are at the opposite, completely at the opposite of cooperation. So I'm asking you, obviously, a very, very complicated question, but still, what kind of compromise could be between this only solution, cooperation, and such big, disastrous political disruptions?
Okay, Jeff, second question, I will provide it. It's, you did mention that while the 6 investment areas would require 2 to 3% of world output, it was almost 10% of world savings, and the financial sector therefore would have to be motivated to come and help the investment, and whether it is through government guarantees or through multilateral development banks holding a part of it, you have to mobilize a very large part of the private sector funding. And that brings me to a question. Can you think of, we've had many discussions on the pricing of carbon, on carbon taxes, on a global carbon market, all of which would provide incentives for the financial services and for the industrial combines to actually move in the direction of the kinds of technologies that would help decarbonization. Do you see any prospects for these?
Great, thanks. Let me take both questions. First with Petro Roman's wise statement, of course, that cooperation is the only solution. At the core of what is happening, in my understanding, is the mistake that the United States made in 1989-90. And it's fitting with the passing of Gorbachev to reflect on that. And I remember those days very vividly, and was trying to help President Gorbachev and many countries in the region at the time. Gorbachev ended the Cold War. He ended it unilaterally. He said it's time for new governments, democracy, and it's time to move forward. The United States interpreted that as surrender. Okay, we're now the sole world power. Rather than magnanimity, the project for the new American century said, now we run the world. Our first mission is to eliminate Russia's allies all over the world, whether in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and so forth. And this was quite consciously decided and explained, but not explained to the public, but explained in private circles. General Wesley Clark has described all of this quite vividly. This was the huge mistake. The expansion of NATO into Georgia and Ukraine was the last stop, the red line for Russia that, in my view, was the trigger of this current war. I interpret this war as replaying the first Crimean War, of 1853 to 1856, which was a war by Britain and France to deprive Russia of access to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And the siege of Sevastopol is not so different from what we're experiencing literally in these days. So I think the US pushed too far. The US also came to see China as the great threat, not because China was threatening per se, but because China was successful. This was something that the United States found very hard to accept. A big, powerful country that was not subordinate to the United States. This was not seen in 1992 because these people of the new American century are not very good at arithmetic. They're not very good at economics, so they didn't foresee that China would become a big, successful, powerful country. I know, I think China quite well from hundreds of visits over the last 40 years. I marvel at China's success. I believe it's wonderful for China and for the world. I do not believe it is world-threatening in any way, but it is driving the United States absolutely crazy because it's out of script. And the US foreign policy doctrines exactly say this. They say that Russia and China are the great threats to the US and the world because they seek to undermine US prosperity and US values. To my mind, this is a kind of paranoia, and it creates, if you want to call it nicely, security dilemmas where we say, well, now we need to arm Taiwan. And China says, don't do that. And when China says, don't do that, the US says, okay, we'll do it twice. And China says, please don't do that. Okay, we'll do it twice and we'll have Nancy Pelosi visit. Don't do that. Okay, we'll have Nancy Pelosi visit and we'll have congressmen coming every single week to say how important it is. And then we're going to have a war. This is so clear. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy, the way we're going. I think it's extremely important for countries, government leaders, to discuss this with US counterparts, that this is dangerous. This is not the way the world can go. Public opinion is not the issue here. The US public has no war with China, except if it's told to. It's a manipulation. And I've watched it very close up over the years. It is a kind of neurosis, unfortunately. So the Russia-Ukraine war, in my view, needs to be unwound by ending the Second Crimean War, by Ukraine's neutrality, Russia's withdrawal, pragmatic answers for some of the outstanding issues, but not by defeating Putin, which is the Western war aim, which is mind-boggling in how wrong that war aim is, both unachievable and dangerous. And yet I was with EU leaders last week. They use that language. And we need to move beyond that. So this, I think, is the Russia-Ukraine side. And then really ASEAN and the MENA region and the African Union and Latin America need to be very clear with the United States. We are not on side for a Cold War between the US and China. It's completely unacceptable, outmoded, and unthinkable, actually. The US will pull back if it hears from enough leaders around the world that this is not the world agenda, because the US absolutely cannot lose all diplomatic support around the world. But it doesn't understand, I'm telling you, I speak to the White House, I speak to the Treasury, they don't understand the views of most of the world. Finally, on the financial sector, Ismail, just to say, the huge challenges are first to have coherent national plans, because it's not possible to mobilize the investment just on the basis of ad hoc ideas. So countries need large, long-term, transformative plans with numbers attached on scale of investment. Second, they need mechanisms to ensure that when a solar system is created, people pay, and that is used in the long term to service the debts or the equity that have gone into building the new energy system. So basic project financing and long-term planning is necessary to show that these are absolutely bankable propositions. My point is that something that looks unbankable right now on a 5-year Euro bond at 10% interest actually is fully bankable on a 40-year loan at 3% interest, backed up by a plan and an institutional arrangement. Within that framework, then one can add the tax subsidies that the US has just given, or emissions trading, or carbon pricing and carbon taxation as the support for enabling that finance to flow. And surely it would play a big role. But simply carbon pricing without the plans and without the institutional arrangements for the utility sector, for example, will not be adequate. And also, I believe that a big bulwark of this must be the multilateral system to help the institutional framework and design, and then the private money can co-finance alongside the public system. The main point that I've tried to emphasize to governments for the last 10 years is the word pathway. Create a pathway analysis so that when I ask the Egyptian government, what is your plan for the energy sector? What will it look like in the year 2050? There's actually a framework that explains that, not just a set of policy tools, but here's how many gigawatts of solar, here's how it's going to be deployed, here is our basic institutional framework, here is our strategy for hydrogen and so forth, here is our regional grid. And on the basis of that, a lot of finance will follow, because investors actually like long-term infrastructure at a safe 5 or 6% yield, if that's what it turns out to be in the end, long-term, if there is a framework behind it.
Thank you, Jeff. We are over the time that you had kindly allotted for us, and we are very grateful for that. Needless to say, we could spend a lot of time talking about the issues of poverty, inequality, a lot of other things, and I see a number of my colleagues have their hands up, but I will say to those who have their hands up right now, we are going into a panel where you will be speaking in that panel, so you'll have a chance to say what you want to say. Let me say thank you, Jeff, for having joined us, and we look forward to seeing you in Sharm el-Sheikh, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yes, without question. I will be there, and we'll see you there.
See you there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. Bye.
Bye-bye.